I'm Rod King, and I'm the founder and campaign director for 20's Plenty for Us. I'd like to spend a few minutes with you today to talk about why 20 mile an hour should be set as the national urban default speed limit for the UK. Perhaps before I start, I can sow a few seeds in your minds of some ideas. First of all, how do we share equitably and safely the public spaces between buildings that we call streets? And secondly, is an urban speed limit that was pulled out of the air in 1934 appropriate for our 21st century mobility needs in the UK? Well, who are 20s plenty for us, or Love 30 as we're called in countries using kilometres per hour? Well, we were formed in 2007, a small team of part-time dedicated people based in the UK. But we have over 500 local campaigns around the country and indeed world. And we have thousands of volunteer campaigners, people wanting to make their places better places to live. Already, 28 million people in the UK live in places where 20 mile an hour is already or will be the norm. We assist and empower those that want lower urban village speed limits to create better streets for people in the UK and all over the world. And we align with the global best practice as defined by the World Health Organization and the UN. What I'm going to cover is some common objectives for communities, local authorities, and national governments, places already saying 20's plenty, to look at the global case for 20 mile an hour or 30 kilometers per hour as an urban default limit. Look at why 20 mile an hour is right for all UK communities, and just a little bit on how we can do that. So first of all, common objectives. And I've shown this first graphic, which actually shows that for drivers, there's a far greater field of vision at 20 mile an hour than at 30 miles an hour. And I think field of vision is something which is important to actually to take our consideration of speed limits way beyond that which a driver perceives into how we can create a healthier, safer, and cleaner environment for all. How can we increase child and adult activity levels? How can we promote healthy, active travel options, meet climate change obligations, especially during COP26, reduce casualties, reduce inequalities in transport, lower emissions, lower noise, have less congestion, and make our places better places? We know we have multiple mobility challenges. 36% of primary age parents are afraid to let their children walk or cycle due to fast traffic. 1 in 5 adults between 40 and 60 years of age is physically inactive. And this early onset of ill health through inactivity burdens our public services and NHS. The casualties cause huge societal costs. And there's dissatisfaction with 30 mile an hour on our streets. Only 10% want 30 mile an hour on residential streets. That's a small minority. And then we have the growth of faster, silent e-bikes, e-scooters, e-cargo, e-bikes, e-cars, and all of these raise risks. You know, the 1934 30 mile an hour urban limit is well past its use by date. It's not fit for purpose or credible. It's already been rejected by 28 million people's local or national authorities. That's 42% of the UK population. 30 mile an hour limits is not helping residents' health, relationships, or business. There's a growing realization that streets are for life. They're not just for motors. And in urban areas, a 30 mile an hour peak speed between those congestion points or turnings or junctions doesn't reduce overall journey time significantly. And still, there are 70,000 reported casualties per annum on 30 mile an hour roads. It isn't working. They're not safe. Will a 30 mile an hour limit ever support active travel? No. Will a 30-mile-an-hour limit on roads ever fulfill the duty of care to children, to the elderly? No. It will make mistakes. And we need a safe environment to them so we can accommodate those mistakes. 30-mile-an-hour speed limits are not evidence to help with any of those objectives which I talked about. 30 mile an hour is not healthy, it's not green, it's not livable. And I ask you to crouch down to see from an 8-year-old's level how 30 mile an hour HGVs are scary. And let's remember that preteens' eyesight can't reliably cope with judging speeds of vehicles above 20 miles an hour. You know, we have inadequate active travel infrastructure. In settlements, 30 miles per hour can only be made safe with protected infrastructure and crossings. 30 miles an hour is too fast in places lacking pavements or cycle roads. A lack of or narrow pavements deter walkers when those speeds are high. And of course, 20-mile-an-hour speed limits do not prevent adding infrastructure to our streets. It just makes them even more safe. So let's look at the places already saying 20 is plenty. Well, it's the majority, over half of the 40 largest urban authorities in the UK. It's all the inner London boroughs and many outer London boroughs. It's the capital cities of Cardiff and Edinburgh. It's many shire counties. Wales is to set a national 20-mile-an-hour urban village limit from 2023. And Scotland has already announced its plans to set 20 mile an hour as the norm by 2025. That's 28 million people either already living or set to live in 20 mile an hour places. And where the 30 mile an hour limit has been rejected as not fit for purpose. So 20 mile an hour limits, we say very much community-led establishment endorsed. You know, of that 28 million, most new 20 mile an hour limits do not have any physical calming. But they're not only signs. They're signs plus engagement, a little bit of enforcement, and a little bit of engineering. It's very much more about hands and minds engagement rather than what I call buttocks and spines engagement with speed bumps. And you know, there are good results in speed reduction and casualty reduction. Slow roads, they're added for consistency and set at 20 mile an hour. On medium speed roads will bring the speed down by 0 to 4 miles an hour and get them generally compliant. And on the faster roads, we'll get a 4 to 6 mile per hour reduction in speeds. Not necessarily compliant, but considerably reduced. And that is why we're getting typical results of casualty reduction. Bath, 23%, Calderdale, 30%, Edinburgh, 33%. And again, here's using the logo which they adopted in Calderdale, very much a Love Your Street campaign. Something which is actually moving the context away from, if you like, the way we perceive it as a driver into something which is actually celebrating the fact that we can make our communities and streets better places to be. But one of the problems is that by being localized in a local authority, it suppresses the normalization of traveling at 20 mile an hour in urban areas. By keeping a national 30 mile an hour limit, we are abnormalizing safe 20 mile an hour speeds and normalizing unsafe higher speeds. And this perhaps takes that original drawing which I showed of that deep chasm which our streets are, and trying to show that if a collision by a pedestrian with a 30 mile an hour car is equivalent to falling from a third floor window, then we're looking at something which is around about 9 meters in depth. That's what is the norm on our streets, which the government says should be set nationally at the moment. How can you create a 20 mile an hour norm in your local authority when the process of setting it is to treat 20 mile an hour as an exception. The Stockholm Declaration 2 years ago said speed should be 20 miles an hour unless you can show evidence that a higher speed limit is safe. Yet in the UK, the legal process is that you have 30 miles or more unless you can show that evidence that 20 mile an hour is needed, and then have all the red tape, obstacles and repeater signs and costs associated with that. A national urban limit of 13 miles an hour will never normalise driving at 20 miles an hour in urban and village areas. It increases cost and complexity. It constantly replays the same arguments about why a 20 mile an hour limit should be implemented. It reduces consistency. And we get this patchwork of progressive and left behind communities. It justifies non-compliance who actually said, well, a street like this in this village is 30 miles an hour. Why should I observe this in 20 miles an hour? It reduces the community ownership. An isolated 20 mile an hour endorses high speeds elsewhere. Setting 20 mile an hour limits street by street and authority by authority as exceptions to a national norm that has been widely rejected is actually ridiculous. And I would maintain that it is illogical for governments to retain a national urban limit of 30 miles an hour and then urge all the local authorities and cities to change it to 20 miles an hour on most of their roads because the national limit is considered inappropriate. This is not good governance. So let's look at the global case for 20 mile an hour and 30 kilometers per hour as the urban default limit. And it's the World Health Organization that says 20 is plenty as a default, and that's to meet sustainable development goals. And it was in February 2020 that third global ministerial conference on road safety that the Stockholm Declaration was adopted, and within that on speed management was that a clear focus of a maximum road travel speed of 30 kilometers per hour or 20 miles an hour in areas where vulnerable road users and vehicles mix in a frequent and planned manner, except where strong evidence exists that higher speeds are safe. And that was endorsed by the United Nations General Assembly, which took and endorsed that Stockholm Declaration. They then incorporated that as a single focus on 30 kilometers per hour as a default in their Streets for Life 6th UN Global Road Safety Week in May this year. And we had NGOs around the world globally pushing for 30 kilometers per hour on 20 mile an hour as a default. And this was thousands of organizations, campaigns, groups of people saying 30 kilometers per hour or 20 mile an hour will deliver the Streets for Life that we want. And following on from that, in its World Health Organization Global Plan, released just last week for its Decade of Action for Road Safety, here it was, for this reason, in urban areas where there is a typical, predictable mix of road users, cars, cyclists, motorcycles, and pedestrians, a maximum speed limit of 30 kilometers per hour or 20 miles an hour should be established unless strong evidence exists to support higher limits. So those key reasons for 30 kilometers per hour and 20 mile an hour: global road fatalities of 1.4 million a year. And this shows a pile of shoes, which is actually equivalent to just one day's global road deaths. There's a global climate emergency, and exhaust emissions are a particular concern around the world, and especially in our cities and villages. And of course, there's a global aspiration for better places, for children to walk, to cycle, for independent mobility, for them, the elderly, and all of us to get around with choices for active travel. So why is 20 mile an hour right for all UK communities? Well, it's what communities want. In successive national travel attitude surveys, 70% say 20 mile an hour is the right speed limit for residential streets. Only 10% oppose it. It's a small minority. Many requests for 20 mile an hour and local authorities are queuing up. The council elections in 2021 favoured those with greener credentials and calling for 20 mile an hour limits. How can the government facilitate the limits desired by residents and communities across the country? Well, how will 20 mile an hour resolve the issues? There's a wide range of benefits. It supports active travel. Rates of cycling to school tripled in Edinburgh. Evaluations show cycling and walking rise. People feel safer. Streets become more pleasant and casualties reduced by 20 to 40%. 20 mile an hour means active travel infrastructure is less costly. It fits in better. Protected cycle lanes and pavements aren't required in those places where you can bring motor speed down, and motors and cycle traffic can fairly share the roads which are at a consistent speed with the duty of care to the vulnerable. And those streets are for all road users, not just those in vehicles. The key point on active travel is that a community that permits 30 mile an hour on residential roads will never be child friendly, and it will always deter physical activity. And there's a moral issue as well. When the speed becomes theft, when it stops us and our children from walking or cycling on our roads through the fear of traffic, which comes with endorsing a 30 mile an hour speed. You know, compliance is improving with scale and also new technology. But we know that on faster roads, speeds fall by 4 to 5 miles an hour plus for signed 20 mile an hour schemes. Additional psychological measures such as centerline removal can reduce those speeds by another 1 to 2 miles an hour. And from April 2022, all new car models should have intelligent speed assistance to keep drivers within the limit. Compliance increases over time. Compliant drivers set the pace for others. And there are things like community speed watch can play a part in the community ownership of the benefits from lower speeds. 20 mile an hour is fair to all and popular. It's fairer to all road users. Risk is reduced, especially to vulnerable walkers and cyclists. And you know, yes, we keep coming back to this. 70% consistently say they want 20 mile an hour for residential streets, and popularity rises after it's implemented. And on casualties, let's face it, the UK has been flatlining on road casualties since 2020. Yes, it reduced in since 2010. Yes, it reduced in 2020, but how much of that was COVID related and the lockdowns which there were? So we need to make a change. And default 20 mile an hour limits reduce casualties. And this left-hand graph shows that when we actually implement 20 mile an hour, and these are predominantly just signs only with some engagement taking from recent implementations in the Scottish borders, Faversham and Tunbridge, that if we plot the speed change against the previous average speed, we find that on the faster roads, we get a greater reduction in speed. And when we apply that to what we know about the risk to individuals for fatalities based on an impact speed, and this is shown in 30 kilometers per hour, we can see that 30 kilometers per hour or 20 mile an hour is a key transition from being slightly injured to actually that steep increase in that risk of a fatality. And it's this combination, right, of our exposure to risk of fatality at higher speeds, plus the fact that 20 mile an hour will reduce the speeds most on those roads where the speed was previously highest, that we see these sort of casualty reductions, which we have in local authorities when they've implemented 20 mile an hour limits. And we've produced a calculator to show the costs and benefits of this. You can look this up at 20splenty.org, cost benefit calculator. Here we show the figure for England. And this will show it for any local authority which hasn't yet implemented 20 mile an hour limits. You can enter the country or the authority. You can enter a predictable cost per person. And we often talk about this being 3 to 5 pence. You can say what percentage of 30 mile an hour streets within that area you want to change to 20. And you can estimate a casualty savings. And here we put in a fairly conservative 20%. And when you do that, it will tell you what are the costs for implementation based on the areas which you want to cover. It will tell you the casualty savings you'd expect, the payback months, and the 5-year benefit. Now, I know you're going to look at that and say, nearly 200 million to implement 20 mile an hour limits for the whole of the England. That's a lot of money. Well, let's put that into perspective. Because if you look at the HS2 cost, it's £307 million per mile. And I've just noticed that I've left the M off of that 307. And even a relatively short road in my local Warrington Western Link is going to cost £212 million to implement. So really, if we can change the way that our roads are across the whole of England for 197 million, then in total transport terms, that is not a great deal. Casualty savings, £520 million. The payback on that is just 4.5 months. And over 5 years, the country will get a benefit just on casualty reductions of £2,403 million. So economically, the case is there to do it. What about emissions? Well, we're in COP26 this week. New research shows that 20 mile an hour limits reduce carbon dioxide and NOx by 25% plus compared to 30 mile an hour. Why is this? Well, the primary reason is that in an urban environment, what affects our emissions most is not the steady state driving at a constant 20 or 30, but actually it's when we keep slowing down, stopping, and then speeding back up again. Because every time we do that, we have to transform the fuel in our car into energy to give us the kinetic energy in that vehicle. And you know, it's plain physics that speeding up to 30 miles an hour is going to require 2.25 times the energy of getting to 20 miles an hour. And when we keep on doing that within an urban environment for junctions, for pedestrian crossings, for congestion, or whatever, right, then the emissions during that acceleration phase of our driving far outweigh the emissions which come from the steady state or constant speed driving in between. And that's why the analysis of this has shown that actually there is a big improvement, right, in emissions, right, when we cap the speed at 20 mile an hour compared to 30 miles an hour. So with transport carbon being such a big part of our total carbon production in the UK, and urban areas being a large part of that, this offers a huge opportunity, right, to actually reduce our carbon footprint of transport by 25% in urban areas. So that is significant, right, and could be a very good way to actually make a change which is cost effective and without huge infrastructure or investment. In fact, just recently, during Global Road Safety Week, there was an article in Local Transport Today by Phil Godwin, who is a quite experienced transport author. And that comment was that a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit for urban areas is now, I think, mainstream. It is the simplest and swiftest way of improving safety for the largest number of people by a logical change, which would also improve the quality of life in other ways. We have everything to gain from a national 20-mile-an-hour limit. So how do we do that? What's the path to behavior change? Well, we start off with the evidence. We know about the physics of speed. We know the causation of casualties. We know the avoidance of crashes. We know the public health benefits. We know the effect on survivability. This is all clear. We know these things already. We need to develop that public consensus about sharing public spaces, about the equality of independent mobility, and also the cost of casualty to us all. It's a cost to us all, not just a few people. And we need to lobby for the establishment consensus, to respond to that community campaign, to the values gained from lower speeds, to set appropriate limits, and for that to become a reference point for our future vehicle use. The establishment, the government, then needs to take that action. And it needs to education and engagement and enforcement on the benefits which society will get from that we'll all get from that if we change our behavior, which is the outcome from that. Lower speeds, community ownership, a better place to be, and lower casualties. But you know, we already have much of this. We know about the evidence of physics speed. The public consensus is there, 70% in favor. The lobbying has been done for that establishment consensus. But the clock is ticking on the establishment taking action at national level. And that's where you can make a difference by adding your voice to the campaign to set a national 20-mile-an-hour limit. The UK should build on the Welsh Plan. It set up a task force group to say, how can we implement 20 mile an hour across Wales? The UK should announce plans for 20 mile an hour as a national limit. It should create that same or similar multi-agency task force. And this is establishing a GIS-based formula for exceptions to be considered. Create that marketing and engagement plan. Work with local authorities. Just get on and do it. Wales is doing it by 2023. The UK, and in particular England, right, could do it by 2025. So if you really want to transform the way those public spaces between our buildings that we call streets are shared, then 20 mile an hour is a norm, is deliverable in minimal time to provide a foundation for the second decade of action on road safety. It is effective in reducing speeds, reducing casualties, and symbolically changing streets in favor of vulnerable road users. There are few constraints in terms of funding, engineering skills, or materials. Will you help set a new national urban 20 mile an hour default limit for the UK? Spain says yes. They have already done it at 30 kilometers per hour. Wales says yes. They're doing it at 20 miles per hour by the year after next. Scotland has said yes, we will set a 20 mile an hour as the norm. It really is time for the UK government to say, yes, we will. It's the most effective, affordable, and popular way to transform our streets and reduce our transport carbon. Thank you for the time. Right. I hope you enjoy the rest of the festival. Thank you.